So in this section, we're going to look at the Refugee Convention, in particular focus on the definition, the legal definition of what is a refugee. But first, a bit of context and background. So the Refugee Convention comes out in 1951. It gets established just after the establishment of the UNHCR, High Commission for Refugees. And it's a response to all the refugees that occurred after World War II. In fact, it's only been very recently, in the last decade, there's been the same number of refugees that we saw after World War II. And so they wanted to sort out this problem, but there was a kind of, they left an unfortunate legacy in responding to the problem of European refugees. Because when they wrote the Refugee Convention in 1951, it was only for people displaced by the war in Europe. And so it was focused particularly on Europe, a very Eurocentric problem. And of course, then countries in Africa and Asia and Latin America aren't going to sign this treaty if it's not about their own refugees. And so there's still like a backlash, even to today, that very few Asian countries have ratified the convention. Now, that was the problem of the European focus of the Refugee Convention was fixed with the 1967 protocol, which kind of updates the Refugee Convention to say this is now for refugees anywhere. And many countries have ratified that. But still we see out of the 147 nations in agreement around the world, very few from South and Southeast Asia. Philippines, Cambodia, Afghanistan, there might be one or two others that have ratified. I think Japan and South Korea have ratified in East Asia. But the number of refugee ratifications of the Refugee Convention is still very low in the region. And part of that is that legacy of being European focused. UNHCR, High Commission for Refugees, is the managing body of that convention, though it doesn't have a treaty body or anything like that, or anything like the human rights treaties. It just has a UNHCR who actually kind of administer it and can and have certain powers through it. Now, the convention itself, the convention doesn't tend to be used to examine refugee rights because they tend to use human rights conventions. Because human rights covers anyone in your territory, whether you're a refugee or not, and the protections coming out of the protections coming out of the Human Rights Convention tend to be more powerful than the protections coming out of the Refugee Convention. But you need the Refugee Convention for some specific refugee issues, like defining the status of a refugee and for things like non-refoulement, which will come back to being sent back to your own country. So the key point there is that the Refugee Convention is not the one that you look to for rights. You look for human rights treaties, but it does define what a refugee is. So let's look at the Refugee Convention. The most important part is the article which defines a refugee. And it's kind of a more complex definition that we need to unpack. We're not going to unpack it a lot, but just look at the main elements. So the definition says a refugee is a person who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion, is outside of the country of its gendered nationality, and is unable or owing to such fear, unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country. So you see there's a lot of key issues there. That refugee has to have a fear and a fear of persecution, and that persecution is because of race, religion, nationality, particular social or political opinion. A refugee has to be outside of their country. If they're in their country, they may be an IDP or they may have a different status, but they can't be a refugee. And also importantly, their country is not willing to protect them. If their country is willing to protect them, they don't need to be a refugee. So we need to unpack all these 5 or 6 elements. So the first one is this idea of the well-founded fear, that the person must fear that they're going to face persecution. And that fear is both subjective, they have the fear, but also objective, the state or that country is going to persecute for them for that reason. And these are, examples of this being persecuted because of your race, because of your sexuality, because of your religion, and so on. Now, the next element is the persecution. There's no real definition of persecution. They most commonly say it's just a serious human rights violation. That persecution should be done by the state actors because you're wanting protection from the state. If it's by a non-state actor, then you have to demonstrate the state is not protecting you. So if it's a wife fleeing domestic violence or people fleeing criminal organization or a non-state armed group, you've got to show that the state is unwilling to protect you from that form of persecution. Okay, but normally it's kind of clear that most refugees are there because the state is attacking them because of their religion or status or whatever. Now, the other important thing, well, another important thing about the Refugee Convention is you can only become a refugee if you're persecuted because you're one of a very specific category of people. There's race, which we just read as ethnicity, being written in 1951. It's kind of before the definition of ethnicity was defined. Because of your religion, because of your nationality, which is kind of rare now. I mean, it occurred a lot in Europe, as you had sort of Polish or Czechs or Germans being persecuted because of that, or political opinion, which is common. And they do have a kind of a more of a catch-all definition, which is your membership of a particular social group. Now, what that means is that because you're a member of this group, you get persecuted. But to be a member of that group, it doesn't mean like you just, join a party or found a group. But that group must have some kind of innate characteristics or immutable features to it, which means that because you're a member of that group and you can't change, then you get persecuted. So, for example, sexuality, if you're persecuted because of being, say, gay or lesbian or transgender, if you're persecuted because you're a woman, if you're persecuted because you're a child soldier, all these are the kind of these particular social groups, because you can't change your sexuality, you can't change being a family of a soldier, or a family of a politician or a child soldier. They're immutable or unchangeable. But if you were, say, a student at a university that gets persecuted, you cannot be a student anymore, for example. But so you've got to be a member of one of those 5 categories. Now, in terms of, and that also in the last bit there is we haven't got there is you've got to be outside of your country and your country can't protect you. Now, what the definition doesn't include or doesn't cover is people fleeing poverty or economic conditions. They're called economic refugees, which are not refugees. If you're fleeing from conflict, a war has broken out and you're trying to look for safety, you're a humanitarian refugee in that case. And it's the same with environmental refugees. There's some talk about including them, but if climate change comes and your land is flooded, you have to go to another country. That doesn't give you refugee status. Now, also who doesn't get refugee status is if you're a criminal. You've robbed a bank and you go to another country to escape going to jail. That doesn't protect you. But this exclusion category does give some leeway for states to reject people, because they say that, you may have been a political opponent, but you're breaking laws in that country. And also some countries just reject refugee claims from what they consider as stable countries who can protect their own citizens. So the most of EU people can't really become refugees, because they'd say, go back to the EU and they can sort out the problem for you. Okay, so there are these limitations to the definition. Okay, and that finishes that section there.